July 12, 1979, Bushwick, Brooklyn. Carmine Galante was having lunch in the courtyard of a small Italian restaurant, a cigar clenched between his teeth, the way it almost always was. He had just finished his meal. Espresso was on its way to the table. He never got to drink it. Two men in ski masks came through the gate off the street, a shotgun and a pistol. In seconds it was over. Galante went down at the table, and the two men with him went down with him. His own bodyguards, standing a few feet away, did not fire a single shot. They simply turned, walked out past the gate, and disappeared down the block. When police arrived, they found Carmine Galante on his back in the courtyard. The cigar was still in his mouth. That photograph became one of the most infamous images in Mafia history, not just because of the blood, because of what the cigar seemed to say. Even in his last second alive, one of the most feared men in the American underworld did not see it coming. To understand how a man like that could be killed in broad daylight by his own people, you have to go back almost 60 years, to a short, thick-necked kid from East Harlem who was already stealing before he had a driver's license. Carmine Galante was born in 1910 in New York City to Sicilian immigrant parents, and he grew up poor in a neighborhood that offered exactly two paths out: a factory job or the street. He chose the street early. By his early teens, he was already known to police for petty theft, and by 17 he had graduated to armed robbery, working with a small East Harlem gang that specialized in hijacking delivery trucks. At 19, one of those robberies went wrong. A police officer confronted Galante's crew, and Galante shot him. He was caught, convicted, and sent to Sing Sing, and it was there that his career actually began. Prison in that era was where young street criminals were sorted, where the connected men serving time for the outfit spotted which of the younger inmates could be trusted to keep their mouths shut and do what needed doing. Galante kept his mouth shut. He came out of Sing Sing with a reputation, and with people who remembered his name. By the early 1930s, he had attached himself to Joseph Bonanno, one of the young, ambitious bosses building what would become the Five Families of New York in the aftermath of the Castellamarese War. Bonanno needed men who would do the ugly work without asking questions, and Galante became exactly that: a driver first, then a bodyguard, and before long, when it was required, a shooter. He was suspected in a string of murders through the 1930s and 40s, including the killing of an outspoken anti-fascist newspaper editor in New York, a hit some investigators believed had been ordered out of Rome as a favor between allies. None of it was ever proven. Witnesses forgot what they saw. Cases fell apart before they reached a courtroom. Galante earned a nickname that stayed with him for the rest of his life: Lilo, the cigar always burning, a man who looked calm because he never needed to look nervous. What set Galante apart from the other rising enforcers of his generation wasn't the killing. Plenty of men could kill. It was where he chose to point his ambition next. In the 1950s, as the American Mafia was building the most profitable and most dangerous business it had ever touched, heroin, flowing out of Marseille and Sicily and into New York through what law enforcement would later call the French Connection, Galante didn't just work the pipeline from a safe distance the way most bosses preferred. He got close to it. He spent years stationed in Canada and Italy, meeting personally with Sicilian and Corsican suppliers, building relationships almost no other American boss touched directly, because doing so meant exposure. It meant paper trails. It meant informants. It meant, eventually, the kind of federal case that could put a man away for a very long time. It did exactly that. In 1962, Galante was convicted on narcotics trafficking charges. He served a shorter sentence first, was released, and then in the late 1960s was convicted again and sent away for a stretch that would keep him in federal prison for more than a decade. For most men, that kind of time ends a career. Galante didn't let it end his. Inside, he kept the network alive through visits, coded letters, and a small circle of men on the outside who still answered to him and reported back. He read Machiavelli in his cell and quoted it to other inmates. He told people, half joking and half not, that when he got out, he intended to become boss of all the bosses in New York, not just his own family, all five. The men who knew him best didn't think he was joking at all. He was paroled in 1974, and he came back to Brooklyn, a very different kind of problem than the one the Commission had put away a decade earlier. His old patron, Joseph Bonanno, was long gone from power, forced out years before in a bloody internal war that left the Bonanno family smaller, weaker, and still bleeding leadership. The family Galante returned to needed someone to run it. Galante decided, without asking anyone's permission, that the someone was him. Within a few years of his release, Galante had positioned himself as the real power behind the Bonanno family's official boss, a quiet, low-profile figure named Philip Rastelli, who spent much of those same years cycling in and out of prison himself. With Rastelli sidelined, Galante ran the family's narcotics operation at a scale that alarmed people who were themselves used to organized crime. Federal investigators later estimated the network he controlled was moving enormous quantities of pure heroin into the country, routed through a chain of small pizza parlors and Italian restaurants used as fronts, a network that would later be exposed publicly in what the press nicknamed the Pizza Connection. The money was extraordinary. The problem was that Carmine Galante had no intention of sharing it. The American Mafia in the late 1970s ran on an uneasy but essential understanding among the bosses of New York's 5 families. Nobody got so big, so fast, or so violently that they threatened to bring down the kind of federal attention that could take everyone with them. Galante broke that understanding on every count that mattered. He expanded his heroin trade aggressively into territory the other families considered theirs. He refused to cut in bosses who expected a share of a business operating at that size. And through his own arrogance more than any formal declaration, he made it known that he saw himself as untouchable, and, eventually, as the man who should be running all of it, not just his own family. Why would a man that experienced, that careful for 50 years, turn himself into the one thing every boss before him had learned never to become, a direct threat to the peace the commission depended on to keep the entire enterprise alive? Because Carmine Galante had spent his whole life surviving by being the most ruthless person in the room, in prison, on the street, in front of a jury. It had worked every single time. Nothing in his experience had ever taught him it would stop working now. The other bosses disagreed, and they were not going to wait to find out if he was right. Quietly, over months, a decision was reached that Galante would not be allowed to take the seat he was reaching for. What made that decision possible, what made it safe to carry out, was that Galante's own family had soured on him too. His arrogance had cost him allies inside the Bonanno organization itself, capos and soldiers who concluded it was smarter to be on the winning side of his removal than to go down defending a man who was about to bring the FBI down on everyone connected to him. That calculation, investigators would later conclude, extended to the 2 bodyguards standing beside him on July 12, 1979. Galante had gone to Joe and Mary's, a small restaurant in Bushwick, owned by a relative of one of the men eating with him that day, for a lunch that was, by every account, entirely routine. He sat in the small outdoor courtyard behind the restaurant, the way he often did. His cigar was lit before the food even arrived. 2 associates sat at the table with him. His bodyguards, Cesare Bonventre and Baldassare Amato, stood nearby, exactly the way they always did. At around 3 in the afternoon, 3 men stepped out of a car parked on the street. 2 wore ski masks and carried a shotgun and a pistol. They walked through the gate into the courtyard, and nobody at the table had time to move. Galante was hit multiple times and died where he sat, the cigar never leaving his mouth. The 2 men dining with him, Leonard Coppola and Giuseppe Tirano, the restaurant owner's relative, were killed alongside him. Bonventre and Amato, the 2 men whose entire job that afternoon was to stop exactly this from happening, did not draw their weapons. Witnesses on the street watched them walk calmly out of the courtyard and disappear, unharmed, while 3 bodies lay behind them. Nobody was ever convicted of ordering the murder of Carmine Galante. The case remains officially unsolved, but investigators and later cooperating witnesses from inside the Bonanno family pointed to the same conclusion. The commission had sanctioned it, Rastelli's loyalists had helped arrange it from the inside, and Galante's own bodyguards had been told, in advance, to simply let it happen. Cesare Bonventre did not get to enjoy whatever reward came with his part in it for long. In 1984, 5 years after he calmly walked out of that Brooklyn courtyard, his dismembered body was found stuffed into 2 glue cans in a warehouse in Queens. In the world Carmine Galante had spent his life building, loyalty could buy you time. It never bought anyone forever. Philip Rastelli, the boss Galante had spent years quietly pushing aside, kept the title until his own death in 1991. The heroin network Galante had built kept running for years after he was gone, until federal prosecutors finally dismantled it, piece by piece, in the Pizza Connection case, one of the largest narcotics trials in American history at the time, built, in large part, on the very pipeline Galante had spent 2 decades constructing. The photograph from that Brooklyn courtyard is still the image most people picture when they picture the death of a mafia boss. A cigar clamped in the teeth of a dead man who had spent 50 years making sure it was always someone else lying on the ground. Carmine Galante broke the one rule that mattered more than any other in that world. Get too big, too greedy, too certain that no one would ever dare, and the men standing closest to you stop being your protection. They become the last thing you see.